Hello, I'm Edward October. Over the years, I've narrated more ghost stories, horror shows, and creepypastas than I can count. And yet, the crimes discussed on our true crime podcast managed to scare the shit out of me. This program is not suitable for children or the faint of heart. If you are such a person, go ahead and switch off this podcast. Listen to something else. Are you still with us? Well, we've warned you.
Hi, Jen.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
I'm pretty darn good. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
Trying not to melt into the sidewalk here because it's hot.
Yeah,
if you've listened to our show.
Who would have thunk it being the end of July that it would be warm? I just got to stay inside with your AC.
That's what I do. I do.
Yep.
I hear you have a pretty involved story, I think is the word.
It's pretty interesting.
Used.
It's pretty interesting. It is the case it is known as the case that haunts Chicago.
Ooh. Well, don't leave us hanging. Let's go.
All right.
I'm ready.
Life in America in the 1950s often conjures up images of an idyllic suburban life. Fueled by unprecedented economic growth after the lean and stressful years of World War II, Americans enjoyed the stability and prosperity that they craved. The innocent and wholesome portrayal of the nuclear family was often depicted in programs like Father Knows Best and Leave-it-to-Beaver. You know, those were the type of shows where every problem could be solved with a good old heart-to-heart talk and a slice of apple pie.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look closer, there are cracks in that facade. The polio epidemic terrified families of the early 1950s. The Cold War raged, and there was little room for divergent views in what had become a homogeneous society. And crime? Oh yeah, it existed, even if the television shows tried to pretend that it didn't. And Elvis Presley, he rocked America, socially and literally, with his huge hit Heartbreak Hotel in January of 1956. And less than a year later, Presley would have a legion of fans and a new movie called Love Me Tender.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on a cold, freezing night in December of 1956 when two teenage sisters disappeared off South Archer Avenue in Chicago after having seen Love Me Tender for the 12th time at the Brighton Park Theatre. Their disappearance and subsequent story would be hailed as the crime that stole Chicago's innocence. In reality, it just shone a light on the less than Leave-it-to-Beaver reality. Living in the McKinley Park neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, Barbara Jean Grimes, born in 1951, and her sister Patricia Kathleen Grimes, born in 1953, they were best friends. They were the perfect example of siblings who actually liked each other. They were always together. They even sang at Mass every Sunday morning. The girls were two siblings of a large family of 7 children, born to Joseph, who was a truck driver, and Loretta Grimes. And even though their parents were divorced in 1951, both parents were still involved in their children's lives. Their mother worked full-time as a desk clerk for a pharmaceutical company to provide for her children. However, to help the family, the children who were old enough all worked part-time jobs as well. Well, like Barbara, she worked at Wolf Furniture House. On the night of December 28th, Barbara, who was 15, and Patricia, who was 12, begged their mother to let them go see Love Me Tender yet again. Initially, Mrs. Grimes had told them no because it was bitter cold, because, Chicago in December, it's cold.
Super cold.
But however, it was Christmas break, and she was feeling generous, so their mother relented. Each girl had $2.15 when they left their house at about 7:30 to make their 1.5-mile walk down South Archer Avenue. Initially, their niece, Kathy, who was 10, was supposed to go with them, but she didn't return home in time from shopping to go. Once at the theater, Barbara and Patricia took their seats by one of Patricia's friends, Dorothy Weinert, and Dorothy's little sister. And now there were 2 showings of the movie that night, and in between, during the intermission, Dorothy and her sister decided to leave. But Barbara and Patricia, who also went by Babs and Petey, decided to stay and watch the movie yet again. They were ultimate Presley fans, really.
Big time.
Mm-hmm. So when Dorothy Weinert left, she saw the two girls in line for the concession stand around 9:30 to get popcorn. And then at 10:30 p.m., another friend, Dorothy Fisher, saw the girls at the theater and reported that they were alone. Like alone being the two are together, there was nobody else with them. Mrs. Grimes knew that sometimes her daughter would stay for both showings of a double feature. So when they didn't arrive home at 10, she knew that they decided to see the movie a second time. And they wouldn't be home until around midnight. Midnight came and went with no sign of Barbara or Patricia. And she got a little worried, so Mrs. Grimes sent two of her other children, 17-year-old Teresa and 14-year-old Joey, to the bus stop at 35th and Hoyne to see what the problem was, to see where their sisters were. Teresa and Joey waited, and as one bus after the other arrived, their sisters failed to disembark. By now, it was 2:15 in the morning, so Joey and Teresa went home. Mrs. Grimes immediately called the police, who were not at all concerned at first. Of course not, right? They informed Mrs. Grimes that the girls had probably run away or that they were hanging out with their boyfriends.
Yeah.
Mrs. Grimes insisted that the girls would never run away and that neither one of them had a steady boyfriend. And at one point, the police thought that the girls had maybe run off with some sailors. That's what a mother wants to hear.
Right.
Their 14 and 12-year-old
And they're so
kids.
young.
Right. And the police even suggested that maybe the two girls had even hitchhiked to Nashville to try to go meet Elvis himself. Mrs. Grimes, frustrated beyond belief at how the police completely disregarded her own knowledge of her own children, was grief-stricken. Barbara had plans to go shopping the next day, and Patricia, who was going to turn 13 on the 31st of December, had planned a birthday party for herself, and she had even invited all of her friends. And despite all that, law enforcement's consensus was that the girls would eventually turn up.
They're too young. They're not going to know.
The media was contacted, however, and on the 31st of December, the day of Patricia's 13th birthday, the first article mentioning Barbara and Patricia Grimes' disappearance ran in the Chicago Tribune. While many reports criticized the police for not investigating their disappearance for nearly a week, the Tribune article clearly states that nearly 100 officers were searching for them within 3 days of their disappearance. But now we all know that it's the first 48 hours that are the most vital. Police set up a special task force just to work on the case and put in a monumental effort to find them, and parishioners of the family's church raised money for a reward. When the media sunk their teeth into the story, it took a life of its own, culminating in Elvis Presley himself making a public plea for the girls to contact their mother.
Oh.
In an official statement from Graceland, the king of rock and roll said, quote, "If you're good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." Later, he would make another plea on public radio. The media were quick to connect the sisters' disappearance to another crime that had occurred a year before in October 1955. That was when three boys, John Schisler, 13, and his brother Anton, who was 11, and their friend Robert Peterson, 13, were found murdered.
Oh.
The boys were last seen in the same area as Barbara and Patricia, and they too had even been on their way to the theater to see the movie African Lion. Their nude bodies would be found 2 days later in a forest preserve, bound and gagged, and they had been sexually assaulted. The police set to work trying to find witnesses who were at the theater on the 28th when the girls were there. Hopefully somebody would remember seeing the girls a week later. A man named Roger Menard came forward and said that he had been seated close to the girls for the second showing of the movie and left the theater at the same time they did. He reported that Barbara and Patricia had encountered two different cars along the way home. The first was a more recent model Buick.
How did he know that? Unless he was following them.
Well, they walked the same path.
Okay.
The first was a more recent model Buick, and the second was a 1949 Mercury driven by two teenage boys. The girls had a brief exchange with the boys, and then the sisters continued walking. After that, Roger Menard himself turned down South California Avenue, which led to his home, and that was the last time he saw the girls. A bus driver would also come forward to say that he thought the girls had been on his bus and departed at Western and Archer Avenue at about 11:05 p.m. Later, two boys, Earl Zastro, 15, and Edward Lourden, 17, said that approximately 2 blocks from the Grimes home at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the 28th, They saw Barbara and Patricia giggling and fooling around, jumping in and out of the shadows at one another. The two boys drove around the block to come back around to get a better look. And one of them commented to the other, quote, "Oh yeah, it's those Grimes sisters." And then they drove on. Mrs. Grimes would later say that this sighting of her daughters after they had left the theater was one of the few sightings that seemed plausible. It sounded like their behavior and how they would playfully tease each other. Zastrow and Lorden went to school with the girls and were very familiar with the family. At first, the police suspected that Zastrow and Lorden had something to do with the girls' disappearance, but eventually dropped that line of thought. The police searched freight cars and abandoned houses. More witnesses came out of the woodwork, stating that they'd seen the girls all over. In fact, there was no way most of these sightings could be accurate. I was watching a documentary that was put out by WGN channel in Chicago, and one of the detectives working on it said, all the girls looked the same back then. They all dressed the same. Their hair was the same. So, all these sightings could have been any girl.
Cute little skirts and the little bobby socks. Yeah, yep. I get that.
Witnesses stated seeing the girls on the following day, Saturday the 29th, at a bus stop asking for directions. A friend of theirs said she saw Patricia without Barbara walking down a sidewalk with two other girls. There's a cashier at a different theater claiming that she saw them at 12:45 a.m. on the 30th, walking by her ticket booth. Reports came in of the girls boarding a train, staggering around drunk, and even checking into a hotel room at the Claremont. On January 1st, someone saw the girls boarding a bus. On the 3rd, a department store clerk said the girls were listening to Elvis records at the store. A clerk at the Unity Hotel said that he turned the girls away when they tried to rent a room. On the 9th of January, there were reports that the girls were seen as far away as Tennessee, and these sightings just went on and on and on. On January 9th, heavy snow fell over the area. On January 10th, the same day that 5,000 circulars with the girls' descriptions were sent to law enforcement across the country, temperatures plummeted to 0 degrees. The public grew weary, and the parents were terrified. Mrs. Grimes, suddenly finding herself more and more in the public eye, began to get ransom notes from people claiming to have her daughters.
Sick.
Her level of anxiety and distress was written all over her face. Loretta Grimes went on television, pleading to whoever had her daughters to please let them go. She would forgive them, she said, quote, "from the bottom of my heart." There's video of this, and it's heart-wrenching. All of the reports of the girls wandering around Chicago, getting on and off buses, visiting hotels, while seemingly carefree and without stress, while their siblings and parents were frantically worried about them, and their mother pleading for publicity for some news about them. And it didn't fit at all with the girls' personalities. If they were not under duress and could ride around town in buses, then surely they could just ride one of those buses home and save their mother from sleepless nights and endless worry.
Well, I think that goes back to what that detective or police officer said. They all look the same.
They all,
You're going to
They could have easily been, right. Mrs. Grimes knew in her heart that something was horribly wrong. It just didn't make sense. Around the 19th of January, a thaw crept across the Chicago area, and temperatures had risen to an unprecedented 50 degrees for 3 days. Then, just as the temperatures tumbled again, on January 22nd, 1957, 25 days after the girls went missing, Leonard Prescott was driving down Germany Church Road in Willow Springs when over the guardrail to his right, he got a glimpse of what he thought were two mannequins. He continued his drive home, but something about it just snagged at him. Why would somebody discard two mannequins in that spot? And by the time he got home to his wife, he wanted to go back and have a closer look. The couple got back into the car and drove back to the place on the road and discovered that what he had seen was in fact not mannequins at all. It was the naked bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes.
It's awful.
The Prescotts immediately called the police, and the police in turn immediately called Joseph Grimes to come to the scene near Devil's Creek Bridge to identify his daughters. And he made a positive identification. The two shy, petite Grimes girls were dead. There's video of that too, and the police have him walking him down with both arms, and it's heart-wrenching. These poor families that have to go through all this.
I don't
ever want to
know. Nope.
Barbara Grimes, the oldest of the two, but she was smaller in stature, was lying on her left side, while Patricia had been tossed on top of her sister belly up. Photos from that day showed dozens of cars lined up along both sides of the roads. Some were police, some were journalists, and some were just volunteers. An effort was made to gather as much evidence from the surrounding scene as possible before darkness fell and the snow began. Unfortunately, nothing recovered that day would ever be connected to the crime. A sense of loss and foreboding settled upon the crime scene as the snow began to fall. Police searched the home of Leonard Prescott because many people questioned whether Prescott could have really been able to see the body from the roads while he was driving. He would have been on the left-hand side of the car, looking over his seat, out of his passenger side door over the guardrail, right? I mean, that's a lot to get into. Suspecting that he might have had prior knowledge to the location of the girls or possibly some involvement in their murders, the police needed to eliminate him as a suspect. Mm-hmm. They thoroughly searched his house, even going through his cabinets, but they found absolutely nothing of any concern. The next day, 3 different forensic pathologists performed autopsies on the sisters. Toxicology reports said that there was no signs of drugs, alcohol, or poison in Barbara or Patricia's system. Unfortunately, no obvious cause of death could be determined. So while their deaths were ruled as homicides, by process of elimination, the cause of death was attributed to exposure and secondary shock. Basically, the shock resulted from exposure to low temperatures, which lowered the girl's body temperature, quote, below the critical level compatible with life. One theory was that the girls were simply left outside in the cold with no clothing and died of hypothermia. The bottoms of their feet were clean and without any scratches, so that eliminated the idea that they had escaped captivity and froze to death next to the highway. One of the girls had 3 shallow puncture wounds on her chest, which were about 3/4 of an inch deep, made by what they thought might have been an ice pick.
Oh.
Some accounts say the wounds were on Patricia, while others say it was Barbara. Either way, pathologists were convinced that the wounds were made after death, possibly to see if the girls were indeed dead. There was some bruising, but nothing severe enough to have caused death. The bodies had also suffered from rodent and animal predation. What's more, the contents of the girl's stomach matched the food that they were known to have eaten for dinner on the 28th, meaning that the girls most likely died within hours after leaving the theater, throwing most of the eyewitness accounts right out the window. In addition, the report stated that Barbara had engaged in sexual intercourse before death, but they could not determine if it was consensual.
So she was possibly sexually assaulted. Right? Okay.
She could have
different
been raped.
Time. I know that that's what they said back then. Today we wouldn't say.
My guess is that she was raped.
Yes.
Barbara and Patricia Grimes were interred 3 days later in the Holy Sepulchre Church Cemetery in Worth, Illinois. Wolfschlager Funeral Home graciously waived all expenses. Barbara and Patricia were laid to rest in matching white caskets side by side so they would be together forever. The media invasion of this sorrowful event was nothing short of inconsiderate and rude. They trampled headstones and flowers on graves to get a glimpse of Mrs. Grimes, black-clad and hollow-eyed, caressing one of the caskets and then the other. Before the family left the gravesite, Mrs. Grimes stopped to pray over another grave nearby, and it was that of another daughter who had died of an illness just 2 years before.
Oh.
It didn't take long for the investigation to become controversial. The Cook County Coroner's chief investigator, Harry Gloss, publicly disagreed with the autopsy findings. He said that several parts of the autopsy report were false or misleading. He claimed that there was evidence of beatings on the girls' faces that went beyond animal predation. He also claimed that evidence proved that the girls were alive until at least January 7th, when the temperatures began to plummet. A layer of ice on the girl's body proved to him that they were warm when they were dumped. Furthermore, Gloss insisted that there was curdled milk discovered in Barbara's stomach. Later, it would come out that the Grimes brothers would say that they had found $10 somewhere, and they'd treated Patricia to a banana split, but Barbara hadn't had any milk products on the day she left, right? So you would think that Patricia would have that in her stomach, but not Barbara. Mm-hmm. Gloss also claimed that both girls had been sexually assaulted and that the sexual assault and other details had been left out or misrepresented to spare their mother's feelings. Also, Harry Gloss was fired on February of 1957. However, a week later, Sheriff Lohman, who agreed with most of Gloss's findings, rehired him to work on the case pro bono. I'm going to hire you, but we're not going to pay you. Yeah. Now, the first real suspect in the case was a man named Walter Kranz. Kranz had phoned the police on January 15th to inform them that he had strongly believed that both girls were dead and that their bodies could be found in an unincorporated area of Lyons Township. Now, how did he know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
He knew this, he said, because he dreamed it.
Oh.
And at the time of the call, he did not leave his name or number, but the switchboard operator was able to trace the call back to him. When the bodies of Barbara and Patricia were found about a mile from where the Krantz had said that they would be, police, of course, zeroed in on him. They weren't buying any kind of psychic dream story. He was brought in for questioning numerous times, and although his handwriting matched the ransom note that was received by Loretta Grimes prior to the discovery of her daughter's body, Krantz denied any involvement to the sisters' abduction and murder. And there was never any physical evidence to put him at the crime scene or even to prove that he knew the girls before their abduction. And police decided that he was just one of those people who became obsessed and insert themselves into a case.
Which does happen, which is
a lot.
Insane to think about, but people do.
One man in particular, however, would become the police's main focus within the days of recovery of Barbara and Patricia. Edward Bedwell, known as Benny, was a former circus worker from Tennessee, and one of his jobs in Chicago was as a dishwasher in a restaurant on Skid Row. After the general public got the news that Barbara and Patricia had been found, the owner of the restaurant phoned the police with a tip. He had seen Benny Bidwell and another man in the restaurant on the 30th of December with two girls who looked like Barbara and Patricia. Bedwell was arrested and interrogated. He said he was in the restaurant with two girls and another man, but the girls weren't Barbara or Patricia. Police, of course, didn't believe him, and what followed was 4 days of coercion on the part of the police. According to Bedwell, he had been kept in a hotel room for 4 days with several police officers. He was stripped of his clothes, physically assaulted, and emotionally tortured. He was also promised that he could go home if he just confessed. His attorney was neither present nor a representative of the state's attorney's office, who was always called in for these types of interrogations. After 4 days, Bedwell wrote and signed a 14-page confession in which he stated that he and his buddy, Frank, in quotations, Frank.
So it's not Frank?
Yeah, had kept the girls for a week, and they had been drinking alcohol and eating hot dogs.
No way, because of the food in the stomach. Okay, go ahead.
And no alcohol in the system. When the two men began to make sexual advances toward Barbara and Patricia, the girls fought them off. This angered the two men, who then beat them and threw them off the ditch on January 13th. And now some sources say that they dumped them off on the 7th. But we know some sources can get, you know how sometimes they differ.
It's a little muddy, yes.
When this Frank was tracked down, it turned out to be a man actually named William Willingham. And he said nothing in Bedwell's confession had happened at all, except that he and Bedwell had been in the company of two women on the 30th, but they were not the Grimes sisters. Now, Loretta Grimes, she didn't believe Bedwell's confession at all. For one thing, not only did she find it implausible that her daughters would hang out on Skid Row with these two men willingly, but the science disproved most of what Bidwell's confession said. She believed the science all the way, and the science said that Patricia's stomach was empty and that Barbara's still had remnants of dinner from the night she went missing, some of which were sweet potatoes. So if Barbara had consumed hot dogs after eating the sweet potatoes, the hot dogs would have been a part of her stomach contents, especially since meat digests slower than plants. There was also no alcohol in the girls' systems, which countered what Bidwell said in his confession. Mrs. Grimes even went as far to tell Bidwell's mother, quote, "I know your boy didn't do this." And Bidwell's mother tearfully thanked Mrs. Grimes. Mrs. Grimes says, "Seems like a hell of a woman."
I think you kind of know, though, too. You know what I mean? I don't know.
And as if the science wasn't enough, there was also the problematic fact that Bidwell was illiterate. He couldn't have even read the confession that he signed, let alone write it. With a little more digging, the police were baffled to find out that Bidwell had been at work at the time of the girl's disappearance and couldn't have even been in the vicinity of the Brighton Theatre.
So they never bothered to check that from the get-go?
To check that first before he spent 4 days in the hotel room getting beaten by his claims. And finally, one of the girls he was with on the 30th came forward to give him an alibi. She obviously wasn't one of the Grimes sisters. Bidwell recanted his confession and was released on bond on February 5th, 1957. The charges were formally dropped on March 4th. However, that wasn't the end of the Bidwell part of the story. He was immediately arrested on a fugitive warrant issued in Florida, where he was accused of assaulting a 13-year-old girl. Some sources say it's statutory rape. The headlines were big and bold in Chicago. Quote, Florida will seek the death penalty for Bidwell. Some investigators were convinced that Bidwell was their man for the remainder of their lives, but not even the jurors in the assault case in Florida could find Bidwell guilty. It took them 25 minutes to return with the verdict of not guilty.
Oh, wow.
The investigation went nowhere. The police interviewed over 300,000 people. They dragged the McKinley Lagoon in search of the girl's clothing, but found nothing. Sheriff Lohman said that he was running on 3 hours of sleep a night, and there was simply no physical evidence to track down. The stress on the family didn't let up either. Mrs. Grimes was basically a prisoner in her own home. She didn't go anywhere without a police escort, and a guard was placed around the clock at her home. The public had become obsessed with the story of her family's tragedy, and people would call her and stop her frequently. Witnesses who felt that they had seen the girls on the night of their disappearance or shortly thereafter continued to call in tips. When a truck driver returned from his long route and discovered that Barbara and Patricia had been found dead, he called the police. It was where they had been found that triggered something for him. He said that he had seen the girls around 71st and Mannheim walking along the side of the road late on the 29th, and that was less than 3 miles from the Devil's Creek Bridge. And this couldn't possibly be the girls if they died within a few hours after their abduction. It does bring up the question of why nobody had seen the bodies lying there the whole time. Snow didn't cover the ground the entire month that they were missing. Another witness, Stanley Ziarski, said that on the night of the girls' disappearance, he had seen them talking with 2 men around 11 p.m. There were 2 other guys in the car, he said. The car was a 1949 or 1950 black Mercury. Some reports say that it was red and black. It was like two-toned. Unexpectedly, however, the girls were seen talking to 3 men at the same car the night before they went missing. Max Fleeg, a 17-year-old juvenile delinquent, was brought in for questioning and voluntarily took a polygraph test, even though he was a minor. During that test, he broke down and claimed to have murdered Barbara and Patricia. It is suspected that his confession was coerced because Matt Fleeg was in juvenile detention at the time of the murders. Police couldn't use the polygraph or confession because he was a minor, and they had to let him go. There's never any physical evidence to connect him to the murders. But Max Fleeg, would later be jailed for the murder of a 14-year-old girl named Mary Lou Wagner.
Wow.
Max confessed to beating her with a rolling pin after she refused his sexual advances. After she was dead, he threw her partially clothed body into an iced-over pond. And I just want to say something here. When I looked into this first, it was like Max Fleeg was arrested for the murder of another woman. And then I'm like, I wonder who that person is. It's got to be in the newspaper, right? She wasn't a woman. She was a 14-year-old girl.
They called her a woman?
But she was for a 14-year-old, or for a woman. He killed another woman. No, he killed a 14-year-old girl.
Killed a child.
Yeah. It's aggravating how the press sometimes does that with ages. You can be a 14-year-old woman, but then the 18-year-old boy, it's frustrating. Anyway. In May of 1957, Mrs. Grimes received a phone call from an unknown man claiming to have killed her daughters. Loretta Grimes said that she suspected that he had also called the day before, since she had received a few phone calls where somebody breathed into the phone for a few seconds and then hung up.
Oh.
However, this time, the call, he openly confessed to killing her daughters. The police and Mrs. Grimes had received all sorts of prank confessions, so Loretta didn't think much of it at first. But then the man with a very distinct voice said, quote, I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed on both her feet. The fact that Barbara was the smallest of the 2 girls was true. And most of the people outside of the Grimes family or the family doctor didn't know this information. And this detail wasn't released to the public until May 22nd, when the Tribune reported the call. Mrs. Grimes believed until the day she died that whoever called her that night was indeed the killer of Barbara and Patricia. However, the possibility of the caller being somebody who happened to be at the crime scene and noticed Barbara's toes can't be ruled out. Nothing much else happened in the case until November 15th, 1958, when a group of Boy Scouts on a nature walk in the Argonne Woods Forest Preserve made the gruesome discovery of a nude, decapitated body in a gully off LaGrange Road. It was just a few miles from where the Grimes sisters had been dumped. The deceased turned out to be 15-year-old Bonnie Lee Scott, who had been missing since September of 1958. On that night, Mrs. Grimes received yet another phone call. Mrs. Grimes was sure that it was the same man who had called her in May of 1957. He said, quote, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one the cops won't solve, and they're not going to be able to blame Bedwell." He didn't want anybody else to get credit for his work. However, he did not call Mrs. Grimes until Bonnie's body was found. So a prank caller who had just saw the story in the paper and decided to torture Mrs. Grimes for no reason, but pure sick pleasure, cannot be ruled out.
Awful.
Police immediately brought in 23-year-old Charles Leroy Melquist, who had volunteered information to the police after Bonnie had gone missing. He said that Bonnie, who was a friend of his, had phoned him to say that she had been arguing a man that, quote, she'd been riding with, and she was about to leave him. The police found this suspicious, and so they placed him at the top of their suspect list. Once her body was found, Melquist was the first person they wanted to question. And he failed the polygraph test.
Didn't see that coming.
And so investigators decided to take him to the offices of John Reed, famous for the Reed technique, which is a coercive method of interviewing suspects that led to an inappropriately large number of false confessions. Go figure. I like it. It's coercive. Eventually, Melquist wrote a 7-page confession admitting that he raped and killed Bonnie Lee Scott by suffocating her with a pillow. After he dumped her body, he had the urge to go back and, quote, do more cutting. He returned the next day just to make sure she was, quote, still there. Then, 3 weeks later, he returned to the crime scene again, decapitating her and kicking her head a few feet away.
What?
Investigators on the Grimes case couldn't help but notice some similarities between the murder of Bonnie Lee Scott and the Grimes sisters, even down to the way their bodies were dumped. If Melquist was responsible for the murder of the Grimes sisters, his level of violence had escalated quite quickly. But another thing that stood out to investigators, Melquist had a little black book of dozens of girls' phone numbers. 2 of the girls in his black book were neighbors of the Grimes family, which meant he could have frequented the Grimes' neighborhood. Melquist was found guilty of the murder of Bonnie Lee Scott, even though he had recanted his confession, saying that when he had written it, it was as if he was in sort of a trance-like state. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, but only served about a decade. Upon his release, he married and had a family, and as far as anybody can tell, he never committed another crime. He's never been formally questioned in the murder of the Grimes sisters because his attorney, who happened to be the attorney of the Chicago Mafia boss at the time, Sam Giancana. Yeah. The boss had forbidden it. And there's not a thread of physical evidence to connect Melquist to the Grimes sisters, but there are some speculation that Melquist was being protected by the mob. That's not the last we hear from the mob, by the way.
Okay. All right.
That's just my opinion. The murder of the Grimes sisters is still unsolved to this day. Theories abound as to who's responsible. For many, the similarities between the Grimes case and the similarities but the 3 boys, the Schuessler brothers and their friend Robert, who were murdered in 1959, are enough to warrant a serious investigation of that connection. And like I said, they were on their way to see the Disney movie, The African Lion, and they disappeared, right? And their bodies turned up 2 days later in a ditch. Now, both crimes involved unattended adolescents about the same age. And in both cases, the teenagers had been to the theater to see a movie. Both sets of bodies were discarded on the side of the road. But however, the level of violence from the Schuessler case is much more prevalent than that of the Grimes sisters. Could that have been made because the killer had been interrupted or he had been rushed when it came to the Grimes sisters? The main difference between the 2 cases that can't be ignored is that one crime was against boys and the other was against girls. Both were sexual, both were sexual assault cases. It took 40 years for the police to solve the crime of the Schuessler brothers and Robert Peterson. But eventually, Kenneth Hansen, who was 22 years old in 1955, was found guilty and sentenced to up to 300 years in prison.
How many years later?
40.
So he was 60-something years old?
When he was
finally...
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. But and he was sentenced in 97, I think it was. And then 5 years later, that sentence was overturned because, quote, after determining the jury should not have heard evidence that Mr. Hansen had cruised the streets picking up boys for sexual relations. This was per New York Times article. He'd been known to assault over 100 boys.
And why could that?
He was
I would think
pedophile.
that would be pertinent to the court case. They said that. Okay.
But then again, he was sent back to trial in 2002, and a jury found him guilty again and was sentenced to 200 to 300 years.
Okay, good. Is he still alive today?
No, he's dead.
Oh.
Which is unfortunate.
Sorry to hear
anyway,
it.
James Hennigan, a now retired Chicago police detective, says that it's not just the similarities between those killings that make him suspect that Kenneth Hansen could have been responsible for the Grimes sisters' murders. Uh-huh. It's the fact that Hansen, a fairly well-known figure in the horse show community at the time, operated several stables in the Willow Springs area. Mm-hmm. And according to Hennigan's research, evidence shows that Hansen was at the Brighton Theatre at the same time.
As
on
the girls?
The same night as the Grimes sisters, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, the girls' bodies were found on property that Hansen leased for the pasturing of horses.
I would say there's a lot of...
Yeah, it was in that Chicago documentary, the WGN documentary that I watched. Mm-hmm. He said that he was just going through files one at a time, and he found this interview with this guy that was at the movie theater that night. He's like, yeah, I was I was there with my boss. And they're like, oh, yeah, who's your boss? And he's like, oh, yeah, Kenneth Hansen. Yeah.
Plus, what a good ploy to get girls to come with you willingly, because that's what I was thinking. How did one man get 3 little boys and then 2 young teenagers? But hey, I have horses. Do you want to come see him? I'm not saying that that's what happened, but that's
right.
That would explain how they would leave with him.
Right.
Interesting.
Now, while Hansen was married with kids and he was a known pedophile, all of his victims were actually boys. Several of his associates, however, were shady characters and known killers. In fact, his brother was involved in organized crime. Right? His brother was the guy that you sent when somebody needed to pay things. I think they called him the Thumper in the documentary. His brother was a Thumper. Mm-hmm. And also his boss, Hansen's boss, was Silas Jane. Do you know
Who's
Silence
that?
Jane?
I don't.
Silence Jane was all sorts of criminal activity.
Is it Silas or Silence?
Silas, S-I-L-A-S, Silas
Just
Jane.
because in the mob, they have the nickname, so he could be Silence, too.
I know. Fraud, intimidation, arson. He was acquitted of arson in 1980 because there was a bunch of horses, or a barn caught on fire and 33 horses were killed.
And they're insured.
He was questioned for the disappearance of Helen Brock, the heiress to the candy company. He also went to prison in 1971 for conspiracy to commit murder. The victim was his brother. He served 6 years. Yeah. And it was found out later that Silas Jane actually covered up the murders of the Schuessler brothers and Peterson.
He did?
It's said that he walked in on Hansen while he was hurting the boys and he found out that Hansen did that and he covered it up because it would look poorly on him. It didn't want to get back that it was on his stables and his horses. Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised he didn't take care of Hansen.
Hansen's with his right-wing guy, maybe. I don't know.
Ugh,
right?
But
Yeah.
In the mob, there's rules, and I'm pretty sure that would pedophile thing.
There's no Silas. I don't believe was in the mob, or there's no connection that I know of for Silas being in the mob.
Okay,
but he might have been connected. I don't know. It's
convoluted.
Yeah,
I got you. Mm-hmm.
Hansen just may have dumped the bodies of the Grimes sisters, right, as a favor or a debt to someone else.
Ah. Okay.
Or maybe he kind of trafficked the girls. He picked them up for somebody else.
Yeah.
That's my thoughts on this. I don't know what to believe, to be honest. But back to that documentary, it's called Innocence Lost, the Grimes sisters. Chicago station WGN did it. I can't find the full thing, but there's like 25 minutes on the internet that you could watch of it. You can find it on YouTube, and I also have it in the show notes because WGN wrote like 3 different articles on it. But they're like 8 minutes apiece. But anyway, when this James Hannigan was interviewed, he was asked, about the fact that Hansen preferred young boys. And Hannigan said that he feels the murders might not have been sexual, but more of like a power thing, like having control over somebody else, right? And he also commented that Hansen and his brother were involved in adult films.
Oh, well.
So, yeah. And that's all speculation. We don't know if that's what happened. It's just what was reported. In 2013, a retired Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson, he's the one that also said that like all the girls dressed and looked alike, and so that's why there could have been so many sightings. He began a personal investigation into this case, and he believes the perpetrator to be Charles Leroy Melcrest. However, Melcrest never committed another crime after he was released from his decade in prison. I mean,
that we know of.
That we know of. I mean, can you stop killing? I mean,
no, but you might get better at not getting caught.
Right. I mean, in an article in A&E True Crime, Johnson said, quote, "Somebody still doesn't want this case to be solved. I know there's at least 3 people alive that know what happened that night." So, who knows? There are so many unanswered questions in this case. Like, why did the girls decide to walk home instead of taking the bus? Did they not have enough money? Their friend Dorothy Weinert swore she saw the girls in line to buy popcorn when she left the movie theater. There's no popcorn in the stomach. Mrs. Grimes pushed back on this statement, saying that Barbara never ate popcorn. But what if they bought something else, like soda or ice cream? Ice cream was available in movie theaters in the 50s. I mean, that would account for the curdled milk in Barbara's stomach that Harry Gloss claimed was in there. The Chicago Sun-Times received an anonymous letter just after the girls' bodies were found. It was from a girl who claimed that she'd witnessed the sisters being forced into a car by a young male on the night of their disappearance. Although she provided a partial license plate number in her letter, the police couldn't locate the vehicle, and the letter's author was never identified. Her letter and a neighborhood disturbance that occurred at about 2:15 in the morning of the 29th led police to consider 4 teenage boys who could possibly be responsible for the murder of the Grimes sisters. And they were familiar with the Grimes family, and they were also along Archer. They were like at the right time at the right place, right? I mean, it was very, pretty much could have been them too. One of the boys had briefly dated Teresa Grimes, the older sister of Barbara and Patricia. When the boys were questioned, they told conflicting stories, although their accounts did share some similarities. They told of riding around buying whiskey illegally and picking up a 17-year-old girl with whom they all had sex with. I don't know if they had sex with that night or if at separate times. The girl was also questioned but never identified. However, one of the boys claimed that there were 2 girls and that one of his friends had forced himself on one of them. The 4 teenage boys were released from police custody, presumably because there was no evidence to prove that they had any connection to the murder of the Grimes sisters. But according to the documentary that I keep talking about, and that whole 25 minutes that I watched, in 2010, a woman came forward to the police saying that her mother, who had recently passed, was told by one of the boys that was in that car that night that the 2 girls that were the Grimes sisters, and the boy told her that as a joke, he forced them out of the car naked, but he didn't kill them.
What?
And only
so
one
then
of the
somebody else just came along and killed them?
Killed them. If this is even true. Now, there's only one of the 4 still alive today, and he's in his 80s. And the police interviewed him, and he said he never saw the sisters that night. It's strange.
I was just going to say, well, it's easy to say I didn't see him that night.
Right.
That I don't know. And I know
he's in his 80s, so he
all
may
that stuff.
not remember.
So much different time.
I don't know.
About what kind of evidence they would have versus today.
Right. There are still people to this day trying to solve this case. Investigators now believe this case will only be solved by a deathbed confession, new evidence, or exhuming the bodies. Detective Lieutenant Jason Moran of the Cook County, Illinois Sheriff's Office Special Victims Forensic Service Unit.
Holy moly, that's a title.
That's a long title. Has a letter hanging in the wall of his office from Loretta Grimes that was given to Lieutenant McMahon of the Chicago Police Department of the time, telling him that she never wants him to give up on her girl's case. And he said it keeps him going. No, he said that he keeps this 65-year-old letter for motivation because things like that is what keeps him going when he does a cold case. Mm-hmm. The case is still open, so if anyone has any information regarding the Grimes sisters case, the Cook County Sheriff's Department has a page where you can submit information, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But Teresa Grimes is the only sibling left of Barbara and Patricia, and she's in her 80s, so it would be amazing if she can see her little sisters get justice.
I mean, I would think that the mother would want them to be exhumed. Have they thought about that? I know it's like a one-shot deal.
Mother's gone.
I know, but I'm saying if today...
Well, they had said that if they would do a good clipping or a scraping of the nails, I guess they didn't do that back in the day, that they would probably get good DNA. And what's weird is Hansen is gone, which I had this here somewhere. I don't know.
But he was in the prison system, so they probably have his DNA.
They do. They have his DNA. But they didn't get he died in 2007. Well, in 2002, I had this somewhere, now I'm pissed.
Don't be pissed.
Hold on.
Just share with us what it is.
I don't know where it was.
Let me guess. It got lost in the police department somewhere.
Yes. It was tested and it came back inconclusive. And now they can't find it. And it was like 2 years, I want to say in 2005, is when it was tested, or it was in the early 2000s, and then
it was tested that late, and it's gone.
Yeah, and now it's completely gone. And that's kind of what makes me wonder if this isn't like the whole
cover up
mafia thing. Like if there's some, I mean, granted, there's only one family that runs Chicago that still kind of runs Chicago today, and it wouldn't have really any connection unless the guy's still alive and they're protecting him. But like the more you peel back these things, just there's a mafia connection, possibly.
Well, what do you think happened? Who do you think?
I don't know. I think since Hansen was there, I think he might have taken the girls for somebody.
That's only because typically pedophiles prefer one.
Right. Even though he's married and he had kids. Right.
And there are some that will do both.
Right.
Abuse both, but usually not.
Right. But yeah, there was DNA of the semen that was taken from Barbara, and it was sent off. It was found inconclusive.
I really wish they would exhume them.
And now they have, Hansen's DNA, and they don't have anything to compare it to. They don't have Barbara's. But I don't know. But
wouldn't they be able to exhume Barbara's DNA from Barbara and Patricia's from Patricia? I mean,
but what would they do with that? I mean, there's no other evidence. Like they were found completely naked. Their shoes, their body, their clothes have never been found.
Whatever happened to their clothes?
No, they don't know. It's complete. They're gone. There was no evidence in the crime scene, just what was on the girls' bodies.
I hate unsolved cases.
I know. And this one,
like two sisters.
I've known about this case, but I really haven't known about, whatever. And then reading through this and going through all the evidence and reading the documentaries, reading the newspaper articles, reading everything on it, it's just like it's much deeper than I thought it was.
I hope one of those retired policemen or people, authors, whatever, I hope they keep pushing it and I hope it gets solved. Well, I mean, you would think that this could be a very solvable case.
Right. Well, the one detective, Hannigan, believes it was Hansen, and he could probably be traced to the mafia, right? Through Silas Jane.
Or just...
and his brother, right? And then the other, Raymond Johnson, that detective, he believes it was Milcrest, whose lawyer worked with came, and he's the mafia lawyer. Not saying it was the mafia, but I mean, it could be the other boys. It could be somebody, a total stranger that nobody knows about.
Which always shocks me. But they pretty much Bedwell, that's pretty much
Bedwell's
out.
No, yeah, he's out.
Okay.
They coerced him, and he had an alibi. The woman that he was with came forward and said, yeah, it was with me. And plus, I mean, he said he was feeding the girls hot dogs and alcohol.
Yeah. And that did not, no.
But I just can't believe, like, the police are like, oh, they're out drinking with friends. They're 15.
14, weren't they? 14 and 12.
Yeah.
And those
maybe
14,
times
14,
could have been that
15-year-olds, well, I was going to say 14, 15-year-olds from 1950-something are drastically different than the 14 and 15-year-olds that we see on Instagram. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, just...
But I just went off with sailors. Come on.
Because that was a big thing back then, I guess.
I don't know. But still, I don't know. It's got me really thinking. And
makes me sad.
And a lot of people are obsessed with this case. Like, there is
because I think it's totally
Facebook
solvable.
Page for this.
Somebody just needs to come forward.
Yeah, well,
Deathbed
that's the only
confession, or you got to exhume those bodies and investigate, take all the evidence off their bodies you can. I mean, this was, it's a long time ago.
That would be really nice to see Teresa find out and get justice for her sisters.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. I don't know if justice could be served. Everybody's in their 80s.
I'd still like to know,
that are
though.
still alive. Yeah.
What if DNA is taken
solved?
and found and it doesn't belong to any of those people?
Right. And then you'd have to go with the mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah. I'd still rather know.
Yep. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, that's good.
It's a big case, but
I was like you. I knew of them, but I didn't know it was
deep down. And it's funny because this was when Loretta, God love her, she's a researcher and she really went in depth with this thing. And she handed me everything. And so I went, and normally what I do is I go read her research and I do the links and everything. And then I read through it and everything. But this time I decided for some reason just to do my own research first. And I kept texting her. And at one point I put, oh my God, Silas Jane is involved in this.
That's funny.
And that's how they got, in 1977, he was interviewed for the disappearance of Helen Brock. And there just so happened to be an FBI informant that said, oh yeah, Hansen killed those 3 boys. Right? And so that's when Hansen's name first got mentioned. But nothing got into it until the 90s. Like Hansen would go around and mention, oh, if you don't do this, I'll kill you like I killed those Peterson boys is what he called them. Yeah. But Hansen never admitted that he did it. He claimed his innocence throughout his life.
Of course he did, because you know why? Those are the worst scum of the world.
Yeah.
Kills kids. Well, you did a good job, as did Loretta.
Loretta did an amazing job on this one. She's a good egg.
She's amazing.
She is. But yeah, that's the Grimes sisters. I tell you, that was more than I ever knew about them. So
I might need to venture over to that documentary and watch it.
Well, I can only find 25 minutes of it. If I could find the rest of it, it would be amazing. But I can't.
Could, but you might have to deep dive it or pay for it or something.
Yeah. Or they have to re-release it. I think they put it out the end of last year.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's pretty new then.
Yeah.
And I guess until next week, remember, lock your doors.
And keep passing by those open windows.
Bye-bye.
Love ya. For more information about this episode, as well as all other sources, please check out our show notes or the podcast website at ourtruecrimepodcast.com. Our True Crime Podcast is developed and created by the hosts, Jen and Cam. Original music and audio mix of all our True Crime Podcast episodes is courtesy of Nico Vertesi from We Talk of Dreams. You can reach Nico at wetalkofdreams.com. Listener discretion is provided by Edward October from OctoberPod VHS. You can find all of his great works on YouTube. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our True Crime Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We can be reached on Instagram and Facebook at Our True Crime Podcast or on Twitter with the handle at Our True Crime Pod. You can also email us at ourtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. We would also at this time like to thank our patrons. We would be so lost without you. Thank you so much. And if you would like to help support the show, you can check us out on patreon.com/Our True Crime Podcast. You can also show your support by leaving a 5-star review on Apple or simply just tell your friends about us. It's that easy. Love ya.